guys do. Explore what's all on their minds. Yeah, not a thing or two, or about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week, and as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, as I explained at the end of our last episode when I teed up this question for you, we just went through this dreadful pandemic, finally put COVID-19 in our rearview mirrors. Well, I guess it's endemic now, but the period of mass death is over, thank goodness. And yet I've been reading articles periodically in the newspaper about things like bird flu, explaining that it's jumped over and infected a few humans all around the world. And then the article always takes a paragraph to explain how crossover transmission is potentially dangerous. And while there's no immediate threat, this could always become the next pandemic. And then scientists have been talking about the next pandemic being inevitable. And that got me to thinking that this would be a ripe topic for mansplaining.
Sure.
So I asked you two questions. The first was a selfish question. How likely is it that we'll experience another pandemic in our lifetimes?
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, are pandemics likely to happen with greater frequency because of human interconnectedness? You know, how humans can travel and see each other all over the world in ways that were never imagined even a few decades ago. And I'm curious about whether that's a potential cause of the next pandemic. So
Yeah.
Those were your questions, and I'm interested to hear what you came up with here. What are the answers?
Okay. Well, as always, thank you for the question. It is always a pleasure to spend 2 weeks thinking about pandemics that cause millions and millions of deaths. So I really enjoyed sitting in this one.
Yes, you can thank me later.
I want to start with something that might feel counterintuitive or even a little uncomfortable to some of our listeners. I want to issue a challenge. Let's all stop thinking about avian flu, the bird flu that you've been reading about, as a threat. Thinking about it as if we're a villain, something that's out to hurt us or even kill us. The avian flu doesn't want that. A virus is an extremely simple bundle of proteins and genes that doesn't want anything. And when we start thinking about a virus as an adversary with a sinister goal, which admittedly is easy to do, we misunderstand the problem. Instead, let's try to think about bird flu the way an evolutionary biologist would. A virus is a stripped-down, no-frills replication machine. It's a strand of genetic material wrapped in a protein coat that is subject to the laws of natural selection. It has no agenda. It is a biological mechanism that copies itself as many times as it can.
And if I can just jump in for a second, we did an episode about whether viruses are alive.
Indeed.
And that was an intriguing question you put to me a few years ago. So dig that up, mansplaining fans, if you're interested in more information about viruses.
Right, yes. So to replicate, a virus needs a host, and that's where things get interesting because we tend to talk about pandemic pathogens like a lethal force of nature, burning through populations and leaving death and destruction in their wake. But when that happens, it's a signal that, evolutionarily speaking, something has gone wrong. A virus is less successful if the host dies quickly. A host that all of a sudden gets sick and dies is not out in the world, living its life and giving the virus a chance to jump to new hosts. It's like a fire that burns hot but quickly burns out. From the pathogen's perspective, the ideal host is someone who feels well enough to go to work, ride the subway, shake a few hands, maybe see a movie, and in the process pass the infection on to a dozen people or more before they even realize that they're sick. So with that in mind, let's consider avian flu, the bird flu. For nearly 30 years now, it's been a candidate for the next pandemic, but it's never quite fulfilled that destiny. When human beings do get infected by H5N1, which is the technical name for the virus, the reported case fatality rate is around 60%. A fatality rate that high seems terrifying, but in a weird way, it's actually good news. The 1918 Spanish flu, for instance, which we talked about in episode 3 of Mansplaining, way back at our beginnings, had a case fatality rate of only 2.5%, and yet it killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide. In short, avian flu is too deadly to become a pandemic. A virus that kills 6 out of 10 of its human hosts and kills them quickly is, in evolutionary terms, not a well-adapted human pathogen. It is a poorly adapted one that happens to be catastrophic when it manages to infect a human host. There's also a concrete biological explanation for why H5N1 has never become a global pandemic. Research from Imperial College London has identified 2 specific barriers to sustained human-to-human transmission of this virus. First, the temperature inside the human nose is around 32 degrees Celsius, and avian flu viruses don't thrive at that temperature. So the first mutation it would need to go through is to mutate in the direction of thriving at around 30 degrees Celsius. But let's say the virus does make it past the nose and into the host's lungs. To effectively infect respiratory cells, the virus needs 2 genetic mutations to the protein it uses to patch onto those cells. Without those 2 mutations, the virus can't effectively infect the necessary cells, and in most cases will simply die out. And that's why avian flu is probably a red herring when it comes to a worldwide pandemic. It's deadly enough to be scary, which makes for good headlines, and we can never guarantee that it won't mutate in exactly the way it needs to become a better human pathogen. But as things stand right now, it's like Ebola, scary enough to turn into a movie, but not likely to become devastating on a global scale.
Okay, that's one down. Let's hope we can cross off a lot of others while we're discussing this today.
Yeah, well, actually, so we have good news about bird flu. The odds are that it won't devastate the world's population, but the good news about H5N1 specifically is not the same as good news about pandemics generally. Let's take a quick tour through the history of pandemics. The Black Death, which was caused by a bacterium, killed an estimated 50 million people in the space of 8 years, between 1346 and 1353, which was between 50 and 60% of Europe's entire population at the time. That might seem really, really bad, and it was, but worse was still to come. The diseases that arrived in the Americas after 1492, as part of what historians euphemistically called the Columbian Exchange, including smallpox, measles, and others, killed an estimated 48 million people, which was 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas. The 1918 Spanish flu, also a viral spillover from birds, killed between 50 and 100 million people worldwide in roughly 2 years. HIV/AIDS, which emerged in humans in the early 1980s, has killed 33 million people and counting. And then there's our good friend COVID-19, which is estimated to have caused approximately 27 million deaths globally between 2020 and 2023.
So you just mentioned 5 plagues, basically, that have occurred in the last, what is it, 700 years.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, you can never predict when the next one's coming, but if we've had 5 major contenders in the last 700 years, that suggests that they're averaging one every 150 years or so. Should we feel confident about that?
Yes, but you'll notice 2 of the ones that I mentioned, AIDS and COVID, happened within our lifetime. So you can forecast from that either we've been enormously unlucky or they're coming at greater frequency.
Something's changed. Yes. Okay, good.
Looking at the list and the years associated with them, a reasonable question is, are pandemics becoming more frequent and more deadly? Or does it just feel that way because we're living through the most information-dense era in human history? So first, let's talk about frequency. The intervals between truly world historical pandemics have not historically been short until recently. There were roughly 500 years between the Black Death and the Spanish flu. That 1918 flu moved at the speed of troop ships and railways, but by 2009, the swine flu was able to move at the speed of commercial aviation, and it reached 122 countries in 6 weeks. A pathogen with genuinely pandemic-level transmissibility today can reach every major city on Earth before most governments have even convened a response committee. That is to say, viruses and the rate at which they mutate have not changed. What has changed is the world we've built around those viruses.
Right. Okay, so the interconnectedness idea is indeed legit.
Yeah, and we're going to go deeply into that. If we're going to deal effectively with rapidly spreading viruses and hopefully stop them short of blossoming into pandemics, we would need to see the next big threat coming. Bird flu tells a really interesting story about pandemics and prediction, a story that's a little embarrassing for the expert community. H5N1 has been on the official watch list since at least 1997, when it caused an outbreak in Hong Kong that killed 6 of the 18 people infected. Since then, there's been 25 years of sustained surveillance, papers, epidemiological conferences, and risk assessments, many of which have essentially been drawing a big red circle around bird flu and saying, this is going to be the next big one. However, 25 years have passed and H5N1 has failed to become a pandemic. Meanwhile, the virus that did hit pandemic status, COVID-19, was not on anyone's short list in 2018. It didn't come completely out of the blue. The SARS outbreak in 2003 had already demonstrated that coronaviruses could make the jump from animals to humans with deadly results. But governments badly underestimated the threat. The UK's National Risk Register, which is a formal government document meant to assess probable threats, assessed a non-influenza emerging infectious disease is likely to cause, quote, up to 100 fatalities. Up to 100. If we were only so lucky.
Yeah.
In reality, the first waves of COVID-19 alone caused over 42,000 deaths in the UK. That government document underestimated the threat by more than 400 times.
That's a pretty bad guess.
Yeah. This is what researchers call anchoring bias, the tendency to over-rely on the first piece of information you encounter or the most recent reference point available. The UK's risk modelers, like most experts in the field, were anchoring on the memory of 2 recent viral outbreaks, SARS, which had been relatively contained, and MERS, which never achieved sustained human transmission.
Right.
They were, as the saying goes, fighting the last war in building defenses against the recurrence of what had already happened rather than preparing for what might soon be happening.
I was thinking of that very expression, Mark. I would have said it if you hadn't just said it in the last sentence.
Okay, gold star. In the world of pandemic preparedness, this is an institutionally acknowledged problem, which is why the World Health Organization has a concept called Disease X, a placeholder name for an unknown pathogen that experts know they can't specifically identify, but also know they need to somehow be ready for its impact. Disease X exists as a category precisely because the people in the field have recognized that their named list of threats are insufficient, and the next pandemic is more likely to come from something they haven't properly characterized than from something they've been watching for decades. There's a related concept which some researchers call the prevention paradox. If a pandemic is successfully prevented through early action, including aggressive surveillance, rapid vaccine development, and a coordinated international response, then those mitigation efforts will almost by definition look like overreaction after the fact. Because the catastrophe didn't happen, the threat will seem to have been exaggerated. This is one of the structural reasons the panic and neglect cycle persists. The moments when we get it right are the moments that look in hindsight like we panicked over nothing. You asked whether another pandemic will happen in our lifetimes. The historical record suggests that it will, and most serious epidemiologists will tell you the same. I think there's a more interesting question, though, which is also more politically charged. What determines how bad that pandemic will be when it arrives? And the answer to that question comes back not to the biology of the pathogen, but to the environment we've built for it to move through. Consider the drivers. Industrial animal agriculture, the type where tens of thousands of animals are packed into close quarters with minimal genetic diversity and constant human contact, is essentially a laboratory for viral spillover. The conditions are ideal for a pathogen to jump species, adapt, and find its way into a human host.
Can I just say about that? At first, when I thought about increased human and animal contact, I thought that was counterintuitive because we came from farming culture where people were close to the land and close to animals into an urbanized society. And I figured it's just the opposite. But when you point out industrial agriculture, it makes perfect sense to me. Some humans are in everyday contact with loads of animals, and
Right.
that's probably a big change from the old days.
Yeah, and also if you think back to the old days, you'd have smallholder farmers with maybe 2 cows, 3 pigs, some chickens.
Right.
And industrial agriculture, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds, maybe even thousands of animals all within a single facility.
Right.
So in terms of a breeding ground from disease, that's much more effective than the old model where if there was a disease in a cow and a farmer got sick, the next farmer might have been 10 miles away and unlikely to get infected by the same disease.
Right.
Deforestation and changing patterns of land usage push human settlements into proximity with animal populations that carry viral reserves we have never been exposed to before and therefore have no immunity against. And then global travel and trade ensure that anything which does break through will circle the globe before the surveillance systems have time to catch up. This is not an act of God, it's just nature and natural selection taking their course. The outcome is the product of deliberate economic and political choices made by identifiable actors with identifiable interests in maintaining profitability. The factory farming industry has a direct financial stake in resisting the kind of biosecurity reforms that epidemiologists have been recommending for years. And the recent political retreat from multilateral institutions, including the erosion of funding and trust in organizations like the World Health Organization, degrades the international surveillance infrastructure that is supposed to catch spillover events early, ideally before they become outbreaks, or if not then, before the outbreak can become a pandemic.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that one because I think there's 2 related problems with that issue. And one is just simple defunding of things like vaccines. You know, what RFK Jr.'s mania against mRNA vaccines and defunding that makes us vulnerable.
Right.
But also age-old health inequities, right? The fact that some people can get a vaccine and others can't. The defunding of USAID by the Trump administration, which will probably kill millions of people
Right.
because they won't be able to get medicines.
Right.
I think you're highlighting something really important.
Yeah, and I called out industries that have an interest in continuing unsafe activities, but you put a second layer of interest over the top of that, which is political interest. The political motivations to use things like suspicion of big pharma to drive voters and to drive support. That's the second layer of self-interest that can contribute to the problem. There's an idea you might have heard of, the black swan, which comes from the writer Nassim Nicholas Taleb, which he uses to label events that are very unlikely. And so when we're planning for the future or deciding where to invest our money, we tend to neglect that possibility in our calculations. The housing crisis was a black swan event. It was unlikely enough that financial institutions and the government did not account for it in their projections, and so weren't prepared for it. Sooner or later, however, even the most unlikely events are going to happen, and then the impact can be devastating precisely because we did not plan for them. You might think that I'm about to say that pandemics are a black swan event, but actually no. Taleb has argued that pandemics are white swan events. After COVID, he argued that a pandemic on this scale was not a black swan event because it was not an unforeseeable outlier. It was, he argued, a white swan, an event entirely compatible with the statistical properties of the world we live in, predicted with high confidence by the people whose job it is to think about these things, and yet somehow treated as a surprise when it arrived. The issue was never that we couldn't know. The issue was that the knowledge is inconvenient for the people who have financial or political incentives to ignore it.
Yeah. So shame on us for letting millions of people die in a white swan event.
Right. In short, as Upton Sinclair once wrote, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it.
Yes, right. Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us. Because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. And did you know that you can now listen to full episodes of Mansplaining on YouTube and check out our podcast music on Spotify? Yep, it's true. Just type Mansplaining Podcast into the search bar on either platform and you'll find us. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really.
COVID's death toll was substantially a product of institutional failure rather than viral lethality. The virus was, by pandemic standards, a relatively mild pathogen for a large portion of the people infected. The catastrophic death toll was a product of delayed responses, degraded international coordination, inadequate surveillance infrastructure, and supply chains for critical medical equipment that had been optimized for cost efficiency rather than resilience. The virus provided the spark that ignited kindling that we'd been piling up for years. The good news is that the same logic works in reverse. If pandemics are shaped more by the environments we create than by the pathogens themselves, then we actually have more leverage over the problem than simple biology would suggest. Platform vaccine technologies, systems where a standardized delivery mechanism can be rapidly loaded with a new antigen, could compress the timeline from outbreak to vaccine from years to weeks. National disease forecasting units, modeled on the kind of sophisticated probabilistic modeling that meteorologists use, could give governments actionable early warning rather than the catastrophic underestimates that characterized the pre-COVID risk registers. Better surveillance in the places where spillover is most likely to occur, at the places in the world where industrial agriculture and wild animal populations intersect, could catch the next disease X before it reaches the city. None of these are exotic ideas. They are, for the most part, policy recommendations that have been circulated for years, waiting for the political will to act on them.
Yes.
The question isn't whether we know what to do. The question is whether the people who benefit from us not doing it continue to have more power and influence than the people who do not.
Yes. In other words, we have the leverage. We may not have the will.
Yeah. We have leverage, but not leadership, if you want to boil it down to something you can put on a T-shirt.
Yes.
I'd like to conclude with this. The next pandemic will not be a natural disaster in the way that an earthquake or a tsunami is a natural disaster. Something that will happen sooner or later, no matter what we do, because it emerges from forces entirely beyond human control. A pandemic is, to a significant and underappreciated extent, a political event. It will be shaped by choices being made right now about how we raise animals, how we manage land, how we fund international institutions, and how much short-term economic convenience we are willing to trade for long-term resilience. Some pathogen will finish the work that we have already started. There was a persistent rumor about COVID that it was made in a lab, fashioned by scientists as a bioweapon. But it almost doesn't matter if that rumor was true, because COVID didn't become a pandemic because it was so deadly. It became a pandemic because the world's response to it fell so far short of what it might have been. Someday the next pandemic will come along, and politicians and news media will treat it as a bolt out of the blue, an unforeseeable catastrophe, an act of God, but we know better. Pandemics are our own creation, and until things change, we're just going to keep creating them.
Yeah, so that's a very dour conclusion, Mark, but I'm inclined to agree with you. You know, when you mentioned the idea that COVID's made in a lab, that reminded me of another potential reason why pandemics can spread in this day and age, and that is like vaccine hesitancy that comes from misinformation and the same lack of trust that we've spoken about many times, including in our last episode about flat earthers. You know, these things are all related. to believe that COVID was made in a lab is almost by definition to have no trust in the institutions that guide
Right.
us, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's a very good point. It's a dimension of the world we've created, which the pathogen moves through, is we've created a world in which a large segment of the population distrusts the things that will protect it against the pathogen.
Yes.
And therefore that greases the wheels for that virus to move through the population.
Yes. Yes. And I fear that we'll be back to square one when the next one comes, even if it comes at a time when many of us who survived COVID are still around to remember it. Very interesting presentation, Mark. I have a bunch of things I want to ask you about. First was to stick with the reasons why pandemics happen in the first place. There's one other thing that you either didn't mention or you soft pedaled. I just want to put it out there, and that is urbanization and population growth. You know, there are many more people than there were when the Black Death was ravaging humanity.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And then those people are going to cities. And, you know, we're in if you look at the history in the broad scope, it's like we're moving to mega cities. You know, that seems to be the pattern of development. So I wonder if you think that has a factor in this.
Oh, I think it's undeniable. I think it's sort of an echo of something we touched on earlier, which is within industrial agriculture, the very large number of animals that are packed into a very small space. The human analog of that is the inner city, right? It's Manhattan,
Yes.
It's Tokyo, it's London, it's Paris, where, yeah, just walking down the street, you're going to come into contact with potentially 100 people. And this is the first time in human history. I mean, megacities go back at least as far as ancient Rome, but in terms of the number of megacities and the extent to which they're interconnected through things like, you know, aviation, that's unprecedented and definitely creates a pro-pandemic scenario.
Right. Yeah, and then another thing I want to mention, you did touch on this, but I want to put it in different words. Like, I'm thinking the difference between preparedness and reactiveness, or if that's maybe not even a word, reactivity, you know, like it makes all the sense in the world to be prepared, but being prepared, that's hard for us. That's hard for humans. Yeah. Humans are much more reactive, right? So bring on life, you know, and then when the new pandemic comes, oh my goodness, we have to wear masks again, you know, like instead of preparing for its onset, we're reacting to it.
Right. Yeah. My sense, it didn't come up in the research, but my sense is one of the things is preparedness can easily look like waste. If you build emergency structures and lay in supplies and then nothing happens,
yes.
and those things end up in landfill, it just looks like waste.
Yes.
Kind of touched on this earlier in the presentation when they talked about I think it was the prevention paradox, that if you do a good job of preventing something, almost inevitably people in retrospect will think that the effort was wasted because nothing happened.
Right.
And so we only notice in the world of pandemics, we only notice when things went horribly wrong. We don't have any public awareness of success stories. And so it leads into a narrative of institutional incompetence in this area, which I think then feeds into distrust when those same institutions say, we need to do these things in order to prepare for the next one.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a vicious cycle, I feel.
Right. Yeah. And then another point I want to make is, you know, while we all fret about the next pandemic, we maybe forget about the eternal vigilance that's required to control the infectious diseases that are with us now, right? Mm-hmm. Diseases like measles that we're losing control of because of our own stupidity, or tuberculosis, which is a disease of the poor that still kills many, many people around the world, you know, or malaria. Right. So maybe this is not the shiny new object of a worldwide pandemic, but we've got infectious diseases and we're not dealing with them the way we perhaps should be.
Right.
We're not controlling them.
That makes me almost think that the success of vaccines against things like polio and measles created societies that no longer took viruses as seriously as we should, right? No one in the West still worries about polio because we have a vaccine against polio that eradicated it in large sections of the world. Then, so if it's been generations since anyone's had the disease, you start to think, well, maybe it wasn't that big a deal in the first place. It doesn't
Yes.
feel like the ever-present threat that can devastate families.
That's right. It becomes normalized and then we tolerate it. I'm thinking of,
Yeah.
we have tens of thousands of people dying in car wrecks or getting hit by cars every year, and we tolerate that. Right?
Yeah.
Similarly, we tolerate all these TB deaths around the world.
Yeah.
It's normalized. Perhaps it shouldn't be.
Yeah, I don't know the figures off the top of my head, but I remember hearing once about how many people die of malaria every year, and it was astonishing, the number of people. It's in the hundreds of thousands of people.
Yes.
Every single year die of malaria. And that's just considered, that's what happens. In certain sections of the world, people die of malaria. That's normal. And so, yeah, it is like car deaths in that respect. There's one other factor which I noticed during COVID times, and I feel like it plays into some of the decisions of parents who choose not to vaccinate their kids and then send them into school, is there's almost a game theory element there where you are thinking that the fact that other kids are vaccinated means that you don't need to, right? If you're sending your unvaccinated kid to a school where all the other kids are vaccinated, that kid's probably not going to get sick because the other kids are vaccinated and they're not getting sick.
Yeah.
So there's this self-centered game theory element where if there's a standard of behavior, you can take advantage of it for your own benefit to avoid a vaccine that you might think has a small chance of making your kid sick, and assume that it's going to be okay because you're skating on the goodwill and the good behavior of the people around you.
Yes.
I don't know if that has struck you like it did me in COVID, where there were clearly people who didn't get vaccinated and they felt safe because other people were vaccinated. And they didn't wear masks and they felt safe because other people were wearing masks. And they were just sort of skating on the behavior of others.
Yeah, it's a very cynical way of being, but I think it probably does exist. I'm not sure it describes all the anti-vaccine lunatics out there who may truly be drinking their own Kool-Aid, high on their own supply, on all the misinformation. But I certainly do think it describes some people who behave that way.
Yeah.
All right, I got a couple more questions for you. One is, do you think AI will have any role in early detection of pandemics or in developing new drugs? We talk about AI so frequently, I feel like we have to ask that question.
Yeah, we talked about it so frequently that now I feel like I can't talk about it anymore. And the answer, I think, is very clearly yes. One thing that AI is unqualifiedly awesome at is sorting through huge amounts of data and looking for patterns. It's really, really good at that.
Right.
And so, yeah, in terms of trying to spot the next outbreak, if you've got records flowing in from thousands of locations around the globe and you're looking for something that's outside the norm, AI will be a really effective way of sorting through that data. And similarly, if you're looking for a vaccine that attaches to a very specific protein, AI will be awesome at helping you find that. And in fact, AI is already being used in vaccine development. So I have no doubt that when the next pandemic hits, the vaccine that is developed in response to it will most likely have an AI element to it.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Okay, last question, just to circle back to where we started. You did mention that you think the consensus among scientists is that there probably will be another pandemic before we die. Is that your feeling as well?
Well, personally, I'm not planning on dying, but if that's your choice, then yes, probably within that time frame, yes.
Yeah, because I've read all kinds of statistics about this, There's a 38% chance it'll happen in the next 25 years. There's a 50% chance, but
yeah, I feel like it's one of those scenarios where you've got like a 20-sided die, and the pandemic is maybe if you roll 1 or a 2 on that die.
Yeah.
And so the way that works out is you could go 100 straight years of just rolling, 3 through 20 and never hitting the pandemic numbers.
Right.
Or it could happen in 2 consecutive years. There's no way to know the frequency, just the probability is that yes, it's probably going to happen the gap between swine flu and COVID was like 15 years. So probably wouldn't be a surprise if it happens within the next 10 to 15 years.
Yeah. I can't help but think selfishly, the pandemics, they kill the young and the old. And as we get older, we become more prime candidates to be taken by the next one. That would be a miserable way to die.
Yeah, though, I mean, take heart from the Spanish flu, Joe, because you might remember that actually killed people in the prime of life.
Yes,
bizarrely.
That's true.
It was sort of a reverse pandemic in that sense.
Yeah.
So fingers crossed, younger people will die and not us.
Okay, on that note, let's quit while we're ahead. Thank you. That was an interesting conversation.
Okay.
I think we did justice to this subject.
Yes.
And you're going to give me a question for next time.
Yes, I did. So I had a question all locked and loaded, but then something happened today that forced its way to the top of my list. So I'll ask that question later. Here's this episode's question.
Okay.
Earlier today, I was listening to Derek Thompson's Plain English podcast, which is one of my favorites. And in the middle of a discussion of religion in America, a guest made an assertion that stopped me in my tracks. Liberals, he said, are statistically speaking less happy than conservatives. If you'd asked me before I listened to that episode, I would have probably said the reverse, because what you see in social media or on the news is conservative politicians and voters who are angry, fearful, full of suspicion, outrage, and hate.
Right.
And none of those things look much to me like happiness. So I'd like to go deeper. Joe, for our next episode, please investigate this question. Are liberals in America less happy than conservatives? What measures of happiness might that podcast guest have been citing? And if the data does suggest that liberals are less happy, why might that be?
Boy, that's an interesting topic. Hearing you recite your thinking on that, I think I would have come to the same conclusion as you, that it was exactly the opposite. So I will be interested to dig into this.
Okay, I look forward to it.
All right, well, you heard it, folks. I'll be talking about whether liberals are happier than conservatives or more miserable and why that might be. And you will have to wait a couple weeks for that answer, but I promise to bring it back.
And I hope that this episode has not made our listeners less happy and more miserable as they wait for that next one to come around.
Yes, we need to include a few happy episodes in with all the misery.
Indeed, yeah.
Mark, but I think we've been doing that. But until next time, that was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then.
COVID-19's not so bad.
Not so bad.
Not so bad. Man or woman, gal or lad, it's endemic. We dodged a bullet, but watch out for that pullet.
Influenza's on my mind.
On my mind.
On my mind.
Let's just hope it's not the kind.
Called the bird flu.
When bird flu comes, there's no doubt
I'll be the first to chicken out.
H5N1's got me scared.
Got me scared. Got me scared.
I admit I'm not prepared to meet my maker.
What's a poor boy to do?
To stave off the avian flu.
Avian flu will kill us all.
Kill us all.
Kill us all.
Fat or skinny, short or tall.
We're all goners.
We're all goners.
We're all goners.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.